Good conversation. That sounds like it's happening, but it is time to start. We are in Exodus, so if you will open to Exodus chapter 12, we're going to be picking up there. If you're visiting or new to the class, we have been going steadily and diligently through the book of Exodus. Jordan ended last week with going through the 10 plagues. Did an excellent job covering that much ground inside of one class. So we're going to pick up there again. So we're going back to the beginning of chapter 12 here. And the 10th plague actually is kind of mixed into chapter 12 and 13 of when it actually occurs, because part of chapter 12 and 13 is the instructions for the Passover. And that was God's command of what must be done on the day of Passover, which is the day that the 10th plague happened. And so we have here in chapter 12, starting at verse 1 here, God commands what must be done on the day of Passover. God performs the Passover, and then God also has the beginning of what we might summarize as new divine ordinances, commands for memorials that this nation is to keep as a remembrance for all the things that God has done and is doing and is about to do for all their generations. And this theme of remembrance is going to be super emphasized during the book of Exodus here as we continue on. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in particular. So the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also called the Torah in Jewish tradition or the Jewish religion, interrupts the narrative of the plagues to list the commands that Israel must follow on the eve of the Exodus. And from a dramatic perspective, this is seemingly poorly situated, as we're being told the history here, and then everything stops, and we're given commands and some very specific details about some things that need to be carried out. And so, in that sense, the suspense is now at its peak, and then we pause for some instructions here. So God is about to bring the final and most devastating plague upon Egypt. And perhaps these laws are inserted here because God will not take the Israelites out of Egypt until they first reaffirm their connection with Him. After all, the purpose of the Exodus is not only freedom, because freedom alone would give way to anarchy. That's why, in God's name, Moses repeatedly demanded freedom for the Israelites so that they may worship God in the wilderness. It was not freedom for freedom's sake. It was freedom to go to know God better, to worship God, and to be His people. Almost all the laws of Moses are given in the wilderness, as we will see when we move forward here. But these commands are unique in that they are given in Egypt before they make Exodus. So beginning at verse 2, we'll start reading here. This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year for you. God has reset the Jewish calendar for them. This is to mark a new beginning, a full reset of their nation and their traditions and the way that they live, right? Right now they are in captivity. They are slaves. They are being abused because of the requests that have been made so far for them to leave. And everything is about to change, and God's denoting that in many ways. And one of those ways is, this is the beginning of a new calendar for you. You're leaving an old life and entering a new one. So on the Jewish calendar, this month is called Nisan or Aviv, and is celebrated as the time of rebirth, renewal, and the beginning of the Jewish nation. In verse 3, God says, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's household, a lamb for each household." So at the beginning of the month, 10 days later, they are to perform these commands that are being laid out, starting with acquiring or finding that Passover lamb. Let's skip down to verse 6. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. So, 2 full weeks into this new month, and this would be 2 full weeks after Moses had gone to Pharaoh and requested again for the people to be let go, and warning him that a 10th and final plague is coming upon the land, and that he should take heed to that. So you might imagine at this point that perhaps Pharaoh has forgotten the last warning, or considered it null and invalid because nothing is happening. 2 weeks have gone by. In retrospect, a lot of the other plagues happened fairly quickly, where the plague began and Pharaoh quickly requested relief, and relief was granted. But regardless, 2 weeks later, as part of the new Jewish calendar, is when the Passover occurs. Let's skip down to verse 14. God says, "Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance." So here we have a divine command from God regarding the Passover, not only for this moment, but for all future generations as well, to be a memorial for them. And we're going to find as we continue that God repeatedly emphasizes the central importance of remembering. So as an aside here, I want to take a moment and mention 6 important commandments of remembrance from 5 books of the Old Testament. In Exodus 20, verse 8, God establishes the 10 commandments, and God says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." In Deuteronomy 16:3, God says, "You shall eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, that is the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that you may remember the day in which you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life." And you'll see that this in Deuteronomy is a repeat and an emphasis and a reminder to remember what is taking place here in Exodus. In Deuteronomy 4, verses 9 and 10, they're receiving the law at Mount Sinai. "Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. And teach them to your children and your grandchildren, especially concerning the days you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, when the Lord said to me, 'Gather the people to me, and I will let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children.'" God is repeating over and over, remember, pass this on, let others remember as well. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 7, "Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to the wrath in the wilderness, from that day that you departed from the land of Egypt until you came to this place. You have been rebellious against the Lord. Also remember in Horeb when you provoked the Lord to wrath, so that the Lord was angry enough with you to have destroyed you." Remember. So God is obviously putting a huge emphasis on not forgetting, which unfortunately, as we continue through Exodus, you will see why he puts such an emphasis on it and how easy it is to remember and the consequences of not remembering. So we should be thoughtful and ask, why is remembering so important? Why is it a common theme, and what good does it do to remember? And not only just to remember and not forget, but to remember in detail, with diligence and repetition, to all generations. Why is this so important? So I want to propose, as an aside here again, a few things that remembering does for us. Number one is remembering endows history with meaning and significance. So if we do not remember an event, then as far as we are concerned, that event never happened. The very act of bringing to remembrance something creates importance on the thing that you were remembering and being purposeful about remembering. And likewise, the very act of forgetting something signifies that it is not worth remembering and therefore not significant. Number 2, remembering enables us to learn from history. We know the old adage, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And indeed, in the great amount of history that we have recorded for us today, we see that play out over and over again. Though it may be difficult to know exactly what we should learn from any given historical event, some historical lessons are pretty obvious. Others may not be obvious until the day that they become very obvious, and then we're glad we remembered or knew of it. So God repeatedly tells us why the Exodus is important, both for Egyptians and for Hebrews. Number 3, remembering leads to wisdom. Without remembering, wisdom is impossible. Wisdom is learning from our own lives, from the lives of others, and ultimately from God and from what God has done. Again, why we are here studying Exodus and why it has been recorded for us. Exodus chapter 10, verse 2 says, "And that you may tell in the hearing of your son and your grandson how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord." Wisdom matters because good cannot be achieved without it. Good intentions without wisdom perhaps could lead to something good, but often will lead to either nothing or to actual evil. And history is rife with examples of good intentions leading to all kinds of atrocities. Things that seemed like a good idea turn out to not be such a good idea for want of wisdom. Next, remembering makes the moral progress of civilization possible. We remember where we came from to know what moral progress or regress we have made as a people together. This goes hand in hand with learning from history and not repeating mistakes. And as we'll soon discover with the rest of the history of Exodus, forgetting happens all too easily, and it quickly, if not immediately, leads to regression in morality, faithfulness, commitment, and progress as a whole. Remembering links us to those who came before us and remind us we are part of an ongoing people. In our case, today, as Christians, it reminds us that we are part of God's people. And we became that way through obedience. And that continues to judgment, right? We are part of God's kingdom, and we know of God's kingdom because we remember the things that have been written down for us. Remembering ensures that evil is not forgotten and allowed to disappear in the ashes of history. This is akin to not repeating history as well. Remembering by ensuring that goodness and good people are not forgotten makes enduring gratitude possible as well. Without remembrance, there's no way to stay grateful. And we'll look at this more in chapter 13 as we get there. Then lastly here, remembering for us today as Christians as well, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 and 2, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are saved, if you hold fast the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain." Again, another emphasis on remembering, do not forget, because if you forget, then all is in vain. And is this not the reason that we're here this morning? Not only to worship our Creator, but to study and to learn and to grow and to remember and to remind one another over and over again what this short life is all about. So indeed, we should read, learn, and remember. Verses 21 through 27. Let's read that really quickly here. Chapter 12, verse 21. "Then Moses called for the elders of Israel and said to them, 'Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families and slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and to the two doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come in to your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passes over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshiped. I want to take a moment and do another aside here and talk about Jewish tradition as it is today, because there's some very interesting things that still happen around the observance of Passover. And so here in verse 26, we read, and when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? There's actually 4 times that this type of question or phrasing is talked about in teaching your children and letting them know and letting them understand and not forget what is about to happen here. So from Jewish tradition today, what they do right now, there are 4 key verses. 3 of them are in Exodus and 1 is in Deuteronomy. And it's interesting and just neat to kind of know that every Passover, when they observe this, these 4 questions or 4 times that this happens, they associate each one of these ways that you iterate this to a child as a type of child. And if you have multiple children, you know there are many types of children out there. So in Exodus 12:26, which we just read, this is associated with the type of bad child. And you might look at this and say, well, I don't see any bad children here in this verse. But the reason they say that is because when the child asks, what do you mean by this rite? Or what does this rite mean to you? Or whatever does this mean to you? The child here is asking, what is it to you and not to me or to us as a Jewish nation or as a community of people? So he is seemingly putting himself outside of the observance of Passover, over the traditions that the Jews are observing here. And he's explicitly excluding himself from history in the community. And the answer, which focuses on God's power both to destroy and save, is intended to make an impression on the child by instilling fear. And again, this is Jewish tradition, so I don't want to imply that this is exactly what this verse is saying, but this is something that they are getting out of this. In chapter 13, verse 14, the question is, what is this, or what does this mean? And this is associated with the simple child, because it is brief and straightforward, and the answer is seemingly brief and straightforward. The answer is, it was a mighty hand that God brought us out of Egypt, the house of bondage. Chapter 13, verse 8, the question is for the child who does not know how to ask or does not know what to ask. And you'll see in 13, verse 8, we read, and you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up out of Egypt. We only see an answer given here. There's no question being asked. The child is not asking a question. And so this is associated with a type of child who does not know what to ask. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20, we have what is called the wise child. We read, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you? And verses 21 through 25 give a rather complete and thorough answer to this child. Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe, against Pharaoh in Egypt and all his household. Then he brought us from there that he might bring us in to give us the land which he swore to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes and to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is to this day. So this child gets the obvious, thorough, and complete answer, being a wise child. And so, anyways, that's just an interesting tidbit into Jewish traditions today, what they have put as part of their Passover remembrance and memorial here. And then also one more thing, in addition to that in Jewish tradition, this as well continues today, there are what is called the 4 questions. And in addition, these are repeated questions that God gives answers to for when your child asks about the Passover. So we have 4 instances here of when the child is asked or is told about the Passover. But then the 4 questions constitute most children's first act of public speaking in the Jewish religion. And they do this in front of adults, and it is not done by affirming a religious creed or reciting statements. It is done by asking questions, which I thought was quite interesting. So the 4 questions are, number 1, why that in all other nights we do not dip vegetables even once, but on this night we dip twice? And the answer is, we only eat unleavened bread because our ancestors could not wait for their breads to rise when they were fleeing from slavery in Egypt, and so they were flat when they came out of the oven. Number 2, why that on all other nights we eat both leavened and unleavened bread, but on this night we eat only unleavened? And the answer is, we eat only bitter herbs to remind us of the bitterness of slavery that our ancestors endured while in Egypt. Number 3 is, why that on all other nights we might eat vegetables, but on this night we eat bitter herbs? And actually, I might have those answers flipped here. But the answer to this one is, the first dip of green vegetables in salt water symbolizes the replacing of our tears with gratitude, and the second dip, a bitter herb in hyssop, symbolizes the sweetening of our burden of bitterness and suffering. And then number 4, that in all other nights we eat and drink sitting with others reclining, but on this night we are all reclining. And the answer is, we recline at the table because in ancient times a person who reclined at the meal was a free person, while slaves and servants stood. So it's interesting to see all these answers are centered around remembrance, because in addition to the fact that they need to remember these things, a lot of these, the reason they did these things were because they were commands. God told them to do this, and if you didn't do it, the consequence was death. Someone would die in your family. But anyways, there's even a song, if you want to go look on the internet, around the 4 questions and the Passover tradition. And it's kind of interesting to hear them sing in Hebrew these 4 questions. But let's pick back up in verse 28. So we're in chapter 12, verse 28 here. Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. They obeyed God as they heard the word, and you might look back and remember when Moses and Aaron first came to the children of Israel, and they went to the elders and then went to all of Israel and said, God has given us a new mission, and we're going to be freed from Egypt. And they all believed, and they all followed Moses, right? Now, they didn't believe for very long after that, right? And they had to constantly be reminded. But again here, they hear what is being told to them. They know that this is serious, and they follow. Verse 29. Now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captives who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. So the final plague is performed. We have many verses on the sacrifice of the lamb, and the commandment to eat unleavened bread and the things that they are to do as a memorial in the future. But we only have one verse here on the killing of the firstborn. It's as if the 10th plague is too painful or awful to give much more credence to. As you might imagine, many of the firstborn were innocent. Perhaps likely children who had done no wrong could not be perhaps considered part of the offenses that Egypt as a nation was doing as a whole to Israel. But the Old Testament here in no way revels in the Egyptians' punishment or the pain that came from it. In fact, very interesting as well, one of the many laws in the Old Testament that we read about later in Deuteronomy 23, verse 9, actually prohibits the Israelites from hating the Egyptians. 23:9 in Deuteronomy reads, "You shall not detest the Edomite, for he is your brother, and you shall not detest an Egyptian, for you were an alien in his land." Verses 31 and 32. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also." So we finally have the real release of the Israelites. And if you recall, there were several fake or deceptive releases in the past where Pharaoh said, "Sure, I'll let you go. Just, get rid of the plague first." And then the plague would go, and Pharaoh would say, "No, never mind. I changed my mind." And interestingly, here at the very end, Pharaoh asks also for a special blessing on himself from Moses. And you might think perhaps he finally feels defeated. Perhaps this is what it took to make an impression on him or to believe. And perhaps the death of his firstborn made things hit so close to home that it prompted him to yield. Obviously, that is what had to have caused things to get to this point now for him. So the Exodus begins from Egypt, and the things that God said would happen start to happen here. Let's read verses 33 through 36. "The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, 'We will all be dead.' So the people took their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians." It's hard to believe that a nation almost completely decimated by the hand of God, who even Pharaoh's magicians acknowledged during the third plague of flies or gnats, when they said, "This is the finger of God." It's hard to imagine that they would look favorably on the other nation who were not affected by these terrible things that had been happening. They wanted them to go because they said, "If we do not let them go, we will all be dead." But not in a rude or angry or hateful way. And God, as he promised, made the Egyptians to look favorably on the sons of Israel and gave them articles of silver and gold and clothing. Very fascinating. Verse 37, "Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. And a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds and a very large number of livestock." So we've mentioned before, but we have the 600,000 men number here. And a large majority of those presumably had wives and children. And so then a minimum number of 2 or more likely 3 million people is what comprised the Hebrew nation here. The Houston city limits has about 2.3 million people, and that's not including Houston and the surrounding areas. I know we get all that mixed up because if most people look at Houston, Texas as a whole, there's about 7 million people in Houston. But if you can imagine a core central piece of Houston comprising 2 million people, all walking down the Interstate 10 out here. It wouldn't be the same as everyone, 3 million people getting in their cars and trying to leave, because that would space people out quite a bit compared to walking together down the freeway. But this is no small task to gather up that many people and their flocks and their herds and their belongings, as well as the things that the Egyptians are giving to them. But you can see why Pharaoh at the beginning of Exodus became alarmed at the rate at which the Hebrews were increasing. And here we are 80 years later, from when the Pharaoh back then was so afraid that he was killing the baby boys. 80 years later, and the number of Hebrews is approximately 3 million people. Also in verse 38, we read, a mixed multitude went with them. And this seems to imply that along with the Hebrews, there were other people, perhaps from other nations, other slaves, other people in captivity, who may have comprised some of the lowest classes in Egypt. We don't really know, but the word mixed multitude there would imply people outside the Hebrew nation. And then verses 39 through 41, we read that the time from when Israel came to Egypt to this day was exactly 430 years, just as God had promised them. Verse 42, it is a night to be observed for the Lord for having brought them out of the land of Egypt. This night is for the Lord to be observed by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it. I'm going to pause there and do a quick overview of some of the ordinances given here down to verse 50. But the ordinances were, this is to remember it always, and no foreigners to eat of it, only those who are circumcised in part of Israel, including slaves. A sojourner or a hired servant is not to eat of it, and it should be eaten in a single house. And all of Israel is to celebrate this. So then we arrive to chapter 13 here. Let's read verses 1 through 3 of chapter 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and beast, it belongs to me. And Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt from this house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place, and nothing leavened shall be eaten. And verse 4, on this day in the month of Abib, you are about to go forth. So again, God reset that calendar, and that's when they're leaving. Moses tells the Israelites, do not forget this day. Again, we continue to see this recurring theme about remember this great event. And as we previously noted, memory perpetuates gratitude. If there's no memory, there's no thankfulness. Memory perpetuates faith. If there's no memory, there's no faith. And we can see this clearly today as we partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday, right? Christ said, do this in remembrance of me. And as often as we eat the bread and drink the cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. We do this for a very specific purpose, and that is for remembrance. In current Jewish tradition, part of their Passover service is written, in every generation a person is obligated to see himself as if he himself has come out of Egypt. So again, the importance of remembrance, putting yourself back in that place where they were so that you might feel as they felt. Verses 4 through 7. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And they did so. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people. And they said, what is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made his chariot ready and took people with him. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. So we have the departure from Egypt here. Oops, and I'm sorry, I skipped to chapter 14 instead of chapter 13. That's why my notes are not following here. But that is an exciting part. I'm anxious to get there. Back in chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, we have a reminder of the promise of land flowing with milk and honey, more direction given about eating the bread, more information about divine ordinance, and more information about the firstborn that is to be devoted to the Lord. And we arrive there in verses 14 through 16 about teaching your children. And again, that's in reference to the 4 types of child. That would be the answer to the simple child. And then verse 17 of chapter 13, we have the departure from Egypt. Starting verse 17. Now when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near, for God said the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Hence God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. So you'll see here a map of what is likely their path over there from Ramses down to Succoth and down to the Pi-hahiroth, which don't quote me on that. I have no idea how to pronounce that quite very accurately there. But it's interesting here that God could have taken them through an easier way, but they would have encountered the Philistines. Not that God could not have solved that problem for them as well, but God knew their hearts, that these were people who had just come out of slavery, out of bondage, out of cruel bondage, and they were not ready for war. They would have quickly turned their hearts back. As we'll see here, happens anyways, even though they took an easier path from a standpoint of obstacles in their way. So, also in verses 19 through 22, they took the bones of Joseph with them. And if you remember back at the end of Genesis, when Joseph died, he made them swear that God will surely visit you and you shall carry up my bones from here. And so they did. And then at the end of chapter 13 here, we're told in verse 21, the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they may travel by day and by night. Very interesting that God has sent an aid here to lead them out of Egypt. It wasn't just Moses charging the way and leading them out. It was something that likely looked very miraculous, right? A cloud in the day and fire by night would have been a sight to see. And interesting here that they're traveling by day and by night. That sounds quite exhausting to try to get 3 million people to just go all the time. I can't even imagine what a pit stop would look like with 3 million people all at once. So this is quite a sight to behold. Then we arrive to chapter 14 here. Verses 1 through 4. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, and you shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am God. And they did so. So it's interesting here that God reversed course. So as incredible as a pit stop might seem with 3 million people, can you imagine 3 million people turning around and going back the other way? And the confusion that may have ensued from that, it may have seemed strange, even though they're being led by God himself, right, in the pillar of cloud and fire. This pillar has taken them one way and has now turned around and taking them back another way. But God did this on purpose, right, to make a point and to show all of Egypt and Pharaoh that he is God. Verses 5 through 7. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people, and they said, "What is this that we have done, that we have let all of Israel go from serving us?" So as we read accidentally just a little bit ago, we finally arrive at Pharaoh taking chase to Israel. So in spite of the 10 plagues and the complete disaster that was now Egypt, or what was left of Egypt, it seems Pharaoh not only had a hard heart, but also his servants had a change of heart, which is very interesting that it seems not just Pharaoh had this attitude about him and about the Hebrews. Pharaoh continues to refuse to recognize God as the God of the world, as the one able to do far more and above anything else. And not only that, but it appears that Pharaoh had sent men to monitor and report back on the status of the Hebrews. So he let them go, but he also sent people to watch over them, which perhaps is just prudent, but also perhaps doesn't indicate someone who had completely broken down and acknowledged with the death of his firstborn that God is God, and that these things are happening until I acquiesce and let the Israelites go. So, he once again seems to have had a deceptive heart in him, and he created a backdoor or a way to monitor and perhaps eventually bring them back and undo what he had said and promised. The chariots here represent what we might call the latest and most advanced military weapons of the time, right? And 600 of his select chariots, as well as all the rest of the chariots. Very interesting wording here that perhaps there were 600 better chariots or military-grade chariots, and then we also got everything else we could scrounge up in Egypt. This seems to be what it sounds like is happening here. And then all the officers, which would be all of his top military officials, he took them all to pursue the Hebrews. And you might imagine in this moment a destroyed Egypt, and the military, the only thing left to help this destroyed nation is leaving the whole land. Probably not a good idea in hindsight. Verses 8 through 10. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he gave chase after the sons of Israel who were going out boldly. Then the Egyptians chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, with horsemen and his army, and they overtook them camping by the sea near Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. So, very interesting number of thoughts here, several things. One is, in addition to the chariots, Pharaoh brought horsemen and his army. So this is implying that in addition to all the chariots, there were people on horses and there were foot soldiers. And the sons of Israel were going out boldly, or other translations say defiantly. That's very interesting of an attitude that they have as they are finally released and freed from Egypt. And it seems to possibly be going to their head a little bit very quickly. And a bit understandable after centuries of servitude. They had a slave mentality, and they were free from all of those burdens. That was quite the relief for them. But we see that in verses 11 and 12, or as we will see here in verses 11 and 12, the children of Israel quickly have a change of heart, going from speaking boldly to being terrified that the Egyptians are right behind them. And they cry out to God once again. And so not only has their attitude changed from being frightened and terrified, but their complaint here in verses 11 and 12 is sarcastic in nature. Let's read this really quick. Then they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is it not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." "We told you so" is essentially what they're saying. We told you back in Egypt at the very beginning of this that this is too hard. We can't handle this. Freedom or the prospect of God fulfilling his promise is not worth it. And again, to be fair, this attitude of "I'd rather be enslaved than dead" is perhaps what most people might be thinking at this point. Looking back at the American War of Independence, one of the most famous statements was by Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." This perhaps is not a sentiment that most people would have. So the Israelites made it clear to Moses that they valued life, so they would be willing to return to everything that they had just come out of moments ago. Even back to Egyptians seeking to murder all their newborn males in order to avoid doing battle with the Egyptians. And they cried out to God. And we'll stop there as we're over time now, but we'll pick back up